Moving on, we'll look at data types. When we talk about data types, we're talking about categorization of data, the different ways in which we categorize data. But first, let's look at the meaning of data. When we say data, we're talking about raw facts or raw information. For instance, if you count the number of books in a shelf, you will come up with a data, maybe 10 books, 20 books, and so on. If you measure the temperature of a room, you come up with a figure, maybe 35 degrees centigrade, Fahrenheit, and so on. This is data. Or when you check the number of likes you have on your social media, is also data. So data basically are raw or unprocessed information. Then data can be in different forms. Data can be in form of numbers. Just like the counting of books in a bookshelf, you come up with a number. Measure the temperature of your room, you come up with a number, 35 degrees centigrade. These are numbers. Data can also be in form of text. If somebody asks you to provide your biodata, probably you are going to be providing your first name, last name, middle name. These are in form of text. When you are providing data like your age is in form of a number, so it is a numeric form. And in most programming languages, we normally categorize data to enable us to effectively make use of those data. And Python is not different. We have different types of data in Python. So, but we're going to be looking at it this way. We have the numeric types. These are data types in number forms or in form of numbers. And under this, we have the integers, or what we call the ints. We have floats and we have complex numbers. So let's start with the integers. Integers are whole numbers. These are numbers without decimal points. If you have something like 1 is an integer. It doesn't have decimal points. 2 is an integer. 1000 is an integer. As long as it doesn't have decimal point, it is considered an integer. And one more thing, integers can have signs, which means it can be negative or positive. So all these examples I stated out are positive whole numbers or positive integers. We can also have something like -8. -8 is still an integer, but it is a negative number. So integers are whole numbers. Then let's look at the floats. Floats are numbers with decimal points. Something like 10.5 is a float. We have 0.05. This is a float. We have 1.22222 is also a float. And just like the integers, floats can also be positive or negative. So let's have a negative float. If I put a minus sign and put 7.5, this is also a float, but a negative float. So floats are numbers with decimal point. Then the next one is the complex numbers. Complex numbers, we're not going to be dwelling much on this, but these are numbers that have real and imaginary parts. Complex numbers are normally used in scientific or engineering studies, so we're not going to be concentrating on it. We're going to be focusing on the integers and the floats. And an example of a complex number is numbers like 2 plus 2j. So this is one number. This is the real part, and this is the imaginary part. So any number that has real and imaginary parts are considered complex numbers. Now, going back to our data types, we looked at the numeric. Now, let's look at another type of data, which is Booleans. When we talk about Booleans, we have two possible values under the Boolean types. We have the true and we have the false. True is used to denote when a condition is true. When you have numbers that are greater than 0, you can consider them to be true. When you have a non-empty string, it is true. So when a condition is not false, it is true. And the reverse is false. When something is not true, it is false. So we'll have two possible values under the Boolean types. And we're going to be using these Boolean types when we get to the conditionals. Now, let's look at another type of data, which is strings. Strings are usually grouped under collections, but we're going to treat it as an entity of its own. Strings are used to represent textual information and are usually enclosed inside of quotes. Something like, let's say, name is equal to if. If you notice, I enclose this text inside of quotes. So this is a string, is a textual data. And strings, you can use it to represent things like maybe name of a person, nationality, color, and so on. So let's have another example. We have color is equal to yellow. This is also a string. Now let's have another example. This example, we're going to put nationality. And for this, I'm going to be using double quotes. So if you want to represent a string, you enclose text inside of quotes. You can use single quotes, you can use double quotes. But the rule is that your beginning and closing quotes should match. If you are using single quote at the beginning, you should use single quote at the end. If you are using double quote at the beginning, you should use it at the end. If you try to mix it up, you are going to get a syntax error. So for this, I'm going to put Nigeria or Nigerian. So this is a string. You can also use strings to represent maybe description of something, description of an item, or your bio. So we can have something like bio, the one you normally see on your social media. You can have a nice and friendly person. There is no bound. You can put as many text as you want inside of your quotes. So this is a typical example of strings. So far, we've looked at the numeric types and we talked about the integers, float, and complex numbers. We looked at the Booleans, we looked at the strings. We also have another type of data which we call collections. Under this, we have lists, we have tuples, we have dictionaries, and so on. But we're going to look at this when we get to data structures. So for now, we're going to be focusing on the numbers, on the Booleans, and on strings. The next thing we're going to be looking at is how to determine the type of data that you're working with. So let me remove this. And I'm going to start by having this variable is equal to 10. In case you are in doubt, you don't know the type of data that is assigned to this variable, the easiest way to determine this is by using the type function. So I can have print, and inside of this print, I'm going to put type, and I'll put a parenthesis. Inside the parenthesis, I will have num. So let's go ahead and run the program. So from the output, you can see class int. This means integer. So this number is an integer. When we get to object-oriented programming, we're going to learn about classes. But for now, one thing you should know is that in Python, everything is object. So when we get to object-oriented programming, we'll learn about classes, which happens to be the blueprint of object. But for now, what you should know is that whenever you see int, it means the type of data or the type of object or the type of value in question. And in this case, 10 is an integer. So let's change this to 10.5. Of course, this is a float. And we'll run the program, you can see class float. So this means that this is a float. So let's put a negative sign before the number. We also have float. So let's test this with our complex numbers. So we have 2 plus 5j, which is a complex number. and we'll run it. You can see it is a complex number. Then let's look at true, which happens to be a Boolean type. One thing to keep in mind is that, just like I told you before, Python is case sensitive. So if you write T in small letter, you're going to get a syntax error. So the right thing is you use a capital T. And we'll run it again. You can see it is of type Boolean. The same thing is applicable for false. And this is going to give you bool. Now let's try it out with strings. So here I'm going to put if, and we'll run the program. You can see class str. This means it is a string. So if you're unsure of the type of data you are working with, the easiest way is to just enclose that data inside of the type function, and it is going to give you the data. I can put the values outrightly inside of these parentheses. I can just put 5 here, and it's going to show me integer. And another thing to keep in mind is that there's a difference between something like this, 10. For some people, you may be confused, or you may be quick to think that this is an integer. This is not an integer because it's inside of quotes. So let me remove this 5 and put num there. So let's check it out. You can see it is string. But if I remove these quotes, it becomes an integer. And now the output is showing int. So this is how you determine or verify the type of data we are working with. Then the next thing we're going to look at is type conversion or casting. So this is conversion or casting. And for this, we're going to be looking at these 3 functions. We're going to be making use of the int function. We're going to be using the float function, and we're going to be using the str function. So let's get started. So I have num is equal to 10. Of course, this number is an integer. If I want to convert it to a float, all I need to do is to use the float function. So let me call this num1, and I'm going to call this one num2. And for num2, I'm going to write float and put a parenthesis. Here we have num1. So let's go ahead and find the type of data num2 is, and we can do that by writing print type num2, and we'll also print the value of num2. So let me go ahead and print num2. So now we have class float, and we now have 10.0. So this float function converted this integer into a float. Then another example is if I have something like 10.0, which is a float, and I want to convert it to an integer, I can use the int function. So I'm going to change this to int and run the program. So now I've converted it to integer, and it has removed those decimal points. So let me put 5555 and run the program, and you can see it's removed those decimal points. And I know you may be thinking it's going to perform some approximation. No, it doesn't perform approximation. It simply removes the decimal points and the digits that comes after the decimal point. So this is what the int function does. Then the next function to look at is the str function, which is a very popular and widely used function. So let's look at this. Let me remove this and change this to num. And here I'm going to have 100. Of course, 100 is an integer. So for me to convert it to a string, I have to use str method. So here I have print str, and inside of the parentheses, I'm going to put num. And I'm going to change this to num and go ahead and run the program. So you can see we have 100 It may not be outrightly visible here, but we've actually converted it from integer to string. And another example is if I try to convert a string to a number, I'm going to run into a problem. So let's try it out. Let's say I have if here and I use int and I try to run the program. I'm going to get an error because I cannot convert this. It doesn't have numeric values into an integer. But if I have something like this, the characters that make up this string are numeric, so I can easily convert it to an integer. So if I run it, it will work very well. But if I have letters inside of the quote and I try to convert it to int or float, it is not going to work. So let's try it out with the float. This is not going to work. I'm going to run into a problem. Just before we conclude this, let's look at this example one more time. I have 100 and I have num2 is equal to 10. If I say result is equal to num, let me change this to num1 plus num2, and we'll go ahead and print result. I'm going to run into an issue because I cannot add a string to an integer. So if I want to perform addition, I need to convert this num1 into an integer. And I can simply do that by putting int here, since I'm dealing with numeric characters, and then put the 100 in quotes inside of this. So this way, it is going to work. We have 110. Then another thing again is, let's look at 100 like this, and I put this in quotes. If I use a plus operator, we're going to learn more about this when we get to strings. If I put a plus operator between two strings, it is not going to perform the usual addition we expected from numbers. So if we run this program, we're going to see 10010. So this operation is called concatenation when you join two strings together. And a typical example of concatenation happens, maybe, let's look at this example. We have first name is equal to Johnson, and we have last name is equal to Eve. And we want full name to be equal to first name plus last name. And we'll print the full name. This is going to join the two strings together. And if you notice, there is no space in between it. So if you want to include a space in between the names, you have to use another string. And you create a space by using a quote and you put a space in between it. So this means a space. So I can put that space after the plus sign after the first name. So I will have a space like this, and then after the space I'll put another plus sign. So this is going to join this with an empty space and then the last name. So this time around, if we run the program, you can see Johnson Eve. So this is called concatenation. And the next lesson, we're going to learn about how to print things on the terminal, in as much as we've been using print statement for some time, and how to receive input from the terminal using the input statement.